Wonderful to have you together. You put wind in my sails for doing this prep. And as I prepared Psalm 71, I took particular delight in, frankly, my own awareness of the richness of Psalms in composition. There's one line that I know from Psalm 71, from our High Holiday liturgy. Al tishlecheni le'et zikna, do not cast me, do not fling me off in times of old age. Kichlot kochi al ta'azveni, when my strength fails, do not forsake me. And so we have that as a line at High Holidays. It's a popular line for rabbis giving a sermon on aging, though in this context, as we'll see in Psalm 71, it has an added sense of significance. And so I'm going to put it up and read it. It's a psalm that I have rewritten in terms of a word change as recently as 5 minutes ago. Just a subtle one, because words will reappear, and I want to make sure that in English the translation is the same. Here we go. Psalm 71. Do not fling me off in time of old age. In you, Adonai, I shelter. Let me never be ashamed. In your righteousness, rescue me and free me. Incline your ear to me and deliver me. Be for me a palatial rock to come to always. You have commanded my deliverance, for my bulwark and my fortress are you. My God, free me from the hand of the wicked, out of the palm of the wrongdoer and violent. For you are my hope, my supreme Adonai, my trust from my youth. Upon you I did rely from the belly, from the innards of my mother. You drew me. Of you is my praise always. As an exemplar, I am for many, and you are my shelter of strength. Let my mouth be full of your praise all the day, your glorification. Do not fling me off in time of old age. When my strength fails, do not forsake me. For they speak, my enemies of me, watchers over my spirit counsel together, saying, God has forsaken him. Pursue and grab him, for there is no rescuer. God, do not be distant from me. My God, to help me. Make haste. Let them be shamed. Let them perish, adversaries of my spirit. Let them be wrapped with humiliation and disgrace, those who seek my harm. But as for me, always I will hope and add upon your praises. My mouth will recount your righteousness all the day of your deliverance, for I do not know recountiments. I will come with you powerful. I will come with your powerful acts, my supreme Adonai. I will recall your righteousness, yours alone. God, you have taught me from my youth, and until now I have told of your wondrous works, and even until old age and white hairs. God, do not forsake me until I tell of your arm to generations, to all who will come, your power and your righteousness. God reaches the heavens. For you who have done great things, God, who is like you? Though you have shown me many troubles and harm, you return and revive me, and from the depths of the earth you return and raise me up. You increase my greatness, and you turn to comfort me. Also, I will give thanks to you with the lyre instrument of your truth, my God. I will hymn to you with a harp, Holy One of Israel. My lips will sing joyfully when I hymn to you, and my spirit, which you have redeemed. Also my tongue will all the day utter your righteousness, for they are shamed, for they are confounded, those who sought my hurt. Now, this psalm is quite elegantly composed, as we find that all the psalms are. It's divided into two parts in a general thematic way. 1 to 13 is request, focusing on aging, focusing on foes, and verses 14 to the end to 24 focus on praise, the desire to praise God. Now, here, I've had this kind of intuitive curiosity to find out what the middle word is. Here's what's dramatic in this psalm: there are 101 words from verse 1 to verse 13, and 102 words from 14 to 24, which is to say, the middle word of this entire psalm is the word, verse 14, va'ani, but as for me, which is to say, this is a highly personal psalm. God's name is not used very much in this psalm. It's really self-description. And so the middle word, with 111 words on either side, is the word va'ani. But if you take the phrase, then it's those who seek my harm. That's a big part. That's the theme. And, but as for me, always will I hope. And I think that's the bullseye. There are those who seek my harm, and that can be literal enemies, or it can be metaphoric for the challenges of aging. But as for me, despite that, I will hope and add upon your praises. That's the centerpiece of this psalm. But here's something else that's, again, very elegant, and that is this line that I shared with you, verse 9. Al tishlecheni le'et zikna. Now, I've enjoyed the challenge of translation, and I take, there is a certain vanity in wanting to do things a little differently than others. And here, I use the word fling, do not fling me. Usually it's translated as do not cast me off. It can also be do not send me off, do not throw me off. I use the word fling, and I try in my translations to be as literal rather than interpretive, leaving ambiguity, for instance. And I'll show you where I leave ambiguities. But I like the word fling because I have this beloved teacher, and I wrote about it in my introduction for today. His name is Abraham Twersky. He's larger than life to me. He's from a famous Hasidic family, both sides. In the Hasidic world, marriage, when you're part of the elite, is between aristocracy. So on both his mother and father's side, he goes back to the founders of the Hasidic movement and was a Hasidic rabbi. But he found that, unlike his father, a Hasidic rabbi in Milwaukee, people weren't coming to him for counseling the same intimate way. So he became a psychiatrist and dedicated his career to working particularly with addicts of all kinds. Wrote over 60 books, some for Hazelton and the AA community, many about Judaism. Bottom line, I love him as a person. I could tell many stories of how I fell in love with him. But he's a Hasidic rabbi at the same time. And I went to visit him. He moved to Jerusalem about 10 years ago. He's now 90. So last year when I visited him, he was in a lot of physical pain and in a wheelchair for the first time in the years that I've known him. And he quoted verse 9. And he said to me, I now understand this verse. Do not fling me off in times of old age. For he said, what it means to me is, allow me to prepare for each phase of my decline so that it's not all at once. And that's how he described the pain he was in, that it was preparation for each of the phases yet in front of him. Fortunately, he's in less pain now. In fact, I just emailed him a month or so ago and delighted that he wrote back as he's had some challenges. But bottom line, back to verse 9. Here's the Do not fling me off in time of old age. That's to emphasize that sense of it being rapid and as if it's surprising and quick. When my strength fails, do not forsake me. That's exactly 1/3 in to the psalm. And verse 18 is the parallel. And even until old age and white hairs, do not forsake me. Until I tell of your arm to generations, to all who will come your power. So verse 18, symmetrically, is 1/3 from the end. And so I love the symmetry of in the middle word with 101 words on either side is and for me. This is a self-reflective psalm about those two issues of being pursued, vulnerable, and adding to God's praises. And the key theme, what sets this psalm apart, is this is a psalm about the vulnerability of aging and of the ultimate goal, which is to convey to the future generations reasons to praise God, which is the purpose of life that this psalmist describes, and we've seen that before, and that's to praise God. And so now let me begin with the beginning. There's so much to say about this psalm. First thing to note is that, like most of the psalms, verse 1 doesn't begin Le David, Mizmor Le David, doesn't give an introduction as to when there's a moment of significance. It jumps right in. In you, Adonai, I shelter. That is rare. It only occurs twice in the first book of Psalms, and only twice, this is one of the two times, in the second book of Psalms. And therefore, certain modern scholars will ask, or even classic scholars, is this really a continuation of another psalm? Since it doesn't have that normative introduction, some will say it's the continuation of Psalm 70, which we read last week, which is, David and his many foes in his life, and in trying to discern when it was, what moment. There will be those who say it's Avshalom, his son, that it was written not at the early part of his life with King Saul, but the end of his life, and see this as the continuation. Others see it as Psalm 38. In Psalm 38, that's the psalm of illness, a very ill David. And so some say, oh, this is the continuation of that. But most see this as self-contained. There are, again, other examples of self-contained psalms. And that leads to this next piece, and that is, what do the classic commentators understand as when it was written? And they always look for another biblical context. And in this case, they point to Absalom. That's David's son. Remember, David is now old. He's 65, old in that time, when his son rebels. Absalom not only proclaims himself the king, he publicly lies with King David's 10 concubines to demonstrate the usurpation of the throne, his power. And it's a very rough time in King David's life. So this is identified as an ailing, aged king who will die at the age of 70 in the book of Chronicles. It's not clear. Again, this could be written, and as is the case for most Psalms, later. Not necessarily, of course, by David. Stylistically, there are two things that are particular to this psalm. The first is a fancy literary term, and that's hendiadi. Hendiadi are consecutive terms for one concept that are repeated. And so when you look through this, so, like look at verse 2. In your righteousness, rescue me and free me. So rescue me and free me are synonyms. That's an hendiadi, the repetition of a phrase or of a word, either for emphasis or to shade meaning. Or, you have commanded my deliverance. For my bulwark and my fortress are you. Bulwark, fortress, similar. Here I had a lot of wordplay with verse 3, and that is Litzur Ma'on is often, translated as my mighty stronghold. But in looking at commentaries, I saw that Ma'on was also a palace. And if this is written by a king, so you are as understood, this psalm is either by David in the past, seeking God to help maintain his kingship, or it is the messianic. So the classic commentators will also link psalms to the future. So be for me a palatial rock, meaning may there be an endurance of sovereignty to come. So, bulwark, Sal'i is a stone. Tsur, in the beginning of verse 3, is a rock, is a stone. And I don't want to, lots of the translations will translate both of them as a rock, but there's synonyms and they're a little different. And Sal'i, so I thought of, looking up, thinking about stones. A bulwark is a defense of stones, a barrier, particularly in ancient times. And so I smile in that bulwark is at least my own contribution in terms of translation. Well, that's one thing. You'll find through it many Hindiatis, many repeated phrases. Here, look at verse 6. Upon you I did rely from the belly, from the innards of my mother. Now, again, it doesn't have to only be a word, it can be a phrase. So I relied on you from the belly. Now here, the psalmist, I should say, is conveying that he has he's had a relationship from God in the womb. That's like Jeremiah, where God will say of Jeremiah, I knew you yet in the womb. And that's reflected here. I smile, Benjamin Siegel, who I love as a teacher of Psalms, will put in from in utero of my mother for me. That's not exactly, doesn't have a poetic ring, in utero. It's trying to be a little bit too literal. Actually, I translate it literally. Mim a is innards. The word before me, beten, verse 6, many translate from the womb. Literally, it's belly. Some commentators see mim a, the innards, as from the mother's milk. But really, it's a parallel. From you I did rely from the belly, meaning from the womb of my mother. Different phrasing. So again, that's this concept of hendi adi, and the need, because the words are different, to find a different way to frame it, either in terms of choice of words or even a little bit of a choice of emphasis. Here's the second thing that is dramatically different about this psalm. Fully 10 of the verses in this psalm are echoes, are snippets of other psalms. So I'm going to do these because I'm going to read these out only because it's remarkable. Psalm verses 1 to 3 is parallel to Psalm 31, 1 to 3. Verses 5 to 6 is Psalm 22, verses 9 and 10. Verse 11 is 22, verse 1. Verses 12 and 13 is fragments, snippets from Psalm 35, verse 22, 38, 21, Psalm 40, verses 13 and 14. And last, verse 24 here is parallel, a snippet from 35, Psalm 35, verse 4 and 26, and Psalm 40, verse 14. I tell you all that detail because here's a debate among scholars. Is this psalm simply a collage of snippets, which some have said? And if it's a collage of snippets, then one second. If it's a collage of snippets, that's what it is. Or is there another reason that this psalm is making these references to other parts of text? Here's another one that this will say in verse 19, Michamocha, who is like you? Clearly a quote from Exodus chapter 15, verse 11. Here's my sense. Back to this psalm being remarkably purposeful. It's more than simply a collage, or if you will, it's a collage for a purpose. And that's to say, this is a psalm about old age. And I think what's being conveyed, and because it's distinctive, all these snippets from elsewhere, is that the psalmist is demonstrating a harvest of learning, of sounds, of verses that have been part of the collective of the people. So in it, the medium is the message. The medium here is, this is a psalm that is a harvest of life and a harvest of verses that reflect experience of life. It has a very tight opening and closing as well. And that is, if you look at the opening verses, verse 1 and verses 23 and 24, this, you have this, actually, let me back up. Verse 13, which is the end of the first section, ends with Mivakshe Ra'ati, those who seek my harm. That's verse 13, and it's the last words of verse 24, Mivakshe Ra'ati. So two sections that have the same words, but if you look at verse 24, you also have verse 23 and 24, my spirit, the nafshi, and they are ashamed, verse 24. So spirit and shame are in verse 1. You get shame. You get that word shame, and you also have you get back to verse 13, the end of that section. Verse 13, that's where it is. You get shame and spirit. See, shame and spirit. Verse 13, that's the end of the first section. You get that in verses 23 and 24. Here's part of the punchline. Let me go back through it. And again, I have an eye on the clock. We have 5 minutes. Here's something to not overlook sharing with you. Verse 6, a very unusual word. I want to focus on two things. I don't want to overlook it. And that is how this gets cited in the Talmud, this psalm. And here's the punchline. Let me say the punchline, and then I'll go back to the Talmud. The punchline is, here's the psalmist. He is going and reviewing his life. You have been, verse 5, my trust from my youth. Upon you I did rely from the belly, from the innards of my mother you drew me. Of you is my praise always. So there's the sense of, and then that leads to, let my mouth be full of your praise all the day your glorification. Verse 8, do not fling me off in time of old age, or my strength fails, do not forsake me. There's a sense of life review, of a lifelong relationship, of seeing God as a source of deliverance throughout life, and now being aged. And where this entire psalm leads is to exuberance, to jubilation. Verse 22 to 24, he is singing joyfully. His tongue is praising God. There's musical instruments. It's as if in reciting this prayer, he has found his verve. He has regained his vitality. And that's the movement from the psalm. It is just so elegant in how it's composed. And maybe because I'm getting older, I'm very identified with this awareness that the body does change and that the spirit can continue. The Baal Shem Tov, the great teacher of Hasidism, will say of verse 9 that it's not about how old you are chronologically, that this is about finding from within the sense of the joy and the ability to appreciate life, which leads to the praise of God. And so that it's not necessarily about length of days, and though there's still that element as the reality of life. But here's a wonderful thing to share with you. Verse 6, upon you I did rely from the belly, from the innards of my mother, you drew me. This word, gozi, is a very unusual word. And the commentators differ because it's not a usual word. The classic commentators, Rashi and Radak, both of 11th century, they understand it as drew me out, drew me from the womb. Malbim, 19th century, he'll see it as cut off, gozes, who, if you will, cut me, separated me from the womb. But here's the piece that I love, because I knew this story. In the Talmud, they'll focus on the same word, gozi, to try to explain it. And here's what is written in the Talmud 30b and 31a. Before a person is born, they are compelled to swear an oath, quote, be righteous and do not be wicked. And even if the entire world tells you you are righteous, you should consider yourself with your shortcomings as if wicked. What verse suggests this teaching? Now they're quoting verse 6 here, Ata gozi, when you drew me from my mother's womb. So when you drew me from my mother's womb, that word gozi, what is the proof that gozi implies swearing? So when you drew me from my mother's womb, I swore before you. Instead of drew you or cut you, I swore. And what's the proof? From Jeremiah 7:29, it is written, swear gozi concerning your Naziriteship and cast away. And so in the womb, there is gozi, there is a swearing. And what is that swearing? The swearing is, I promise that I will be righteous and see myself as unworthy of being called righteous. Rambam, the great thinker of 12th century, in a book, Sefer HaMa'amarim Eloket, a collection of his sayings, 3:295, says, by swearing this prenatal oath that the Lord is my spirit, it enables one to shift to the essential plane of righteousness, where even obstacles of life are seen as gifts of growth, and most challenging situations are provided victory in advance. So that he's working off the Talmudic image of even in the womb, just before emerging into the world, the fetus takes an oath that when I become human, I will seek righteousness and not see myself in that way. From this verse 6 as a key to doing well in life when times are rough. 10 o'clock, let me pull this together. I love Psalm 71 for its elegance, for its composition of a weave that's clearly purposeful, and maybe because I identify with this vulnerability of the aging world and have this story of a teacher I much love turning to this psalm, and specifically verse 9, in his own moment of pain that came and comes with his aging. And so Psalm 71, do not fling me off in time of old age. And with that, I'm delighted now to see Robert and my teacher, Rabbi Podwall, and to see Neri and Julia, people, not to make you feel bad about coming in a little late. It's a treat to kind of come back and see all of you and to see Jack and Marion. Shirley, I'm glad you're with us today. Any comments? Good to see Fred. Any reactions to Psalm 71? Alex, go ahead.
I can't make head or tails of verse 15.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. You know, Alex, you got a real knack for sensitivity of things that need explaining. So go ahead and ask the question. Verse 15.
Well, it says, I will saper, I will tell
Yeah.
your righteousness.
Yeah.
And then, but because I do not know any tales.
Yeah. So let me deal with that obscurity. Verse 15, let me read it and explain what Alex is so good at kind of sensing as needing explaining. Here's how I translated it. My mouth will recount, yisaper, your righteousness all the day of your deliverance, semicolon, for I do not know siphoros, recountments. So it's elliptical. So here's how the word siphoros can either be related to yisaper, to tell, I do not know, or to count, literally to count numbers. And so I use the word, instead of I will tell of your righteousness, I say recount, because it contains the tension. Is this recounting meaning telling, or is it counting numbers? And so the word sfarot can be translated as, let me give you a couple of translations. Wait, I had just pulled it up. One second. Whoops. Oh, here's the art scroll. For I do not know their numbers, Adin Steinsaltz, for they are far beyond what I know to count. So the tension is when I say in 15, for I do not know recountments, for it is I am unable to recount them all. They are far too numerous to tell your wonders. They are beyond. So I left it confusing intentionally.
So
Because it's a word that gets used nowhere else, farot, right? It's this poetic throwing in a word that can either mean tell or recount. And what he intends to say is elliptical, which is, my mouth will recount your righteousness, but on the other hand, there's too much for my mouth to tell. It's beyond telling. So for I do not know recountments.
It's sort of playing a pun on saper.
Say that again, Alex.
Playing a pun on saper.
Exactly. It can either be a pun on it or it can be a reframing. Because again, what's distinctive to this psalm is this Hindiati, this repeating in another way of reframing the same thing that was said, to provide another shadowing or shading of a idea. And so I think that the tension here, the point counterpoint is, I want to tell and I know I can't tell. There's too much to tell. And the psalmist wrote it elliptically, almost to make you pause and to stumble at the end of the phrase and have to fill in the intention, almost to act out the fact that I can't speak. There's too much to say, too much to count. So that's why I left it so awkwardly translated. And I wanted to come back because it's the same word, yisaper, and siphoros, same root. So I translate as recount and recountments. But thank you. I'm so glad, Alex, that you felt that ambiguity. And again, I marvel over the psalmist intentionally being elliptical. Any other things that kind of caught you in this psalm as a question? Mimi, go ahead.
I noticed that this doesn't have the first part where he's requesting. Part of it is against the enemies, but it's not as physical as many of the other psalms are. And I noticed in verse 13, it's mental and emotional. It's not physical. Let them be shamed. Let them perish, but it doesn't have a physical way of perishing.
Yeah.
And let them be humiliation and disgrace.
So, two possibilities to your sensitive awareness, Mimi, in contrast to other psalms, where in this psalm, the enemy is not being asked, to walk in his blood. In those extreme cases, here, just let them be shamed. So for the classic commentators, that's because he's dealing with his son. And literally, when word comes to him that his son has died, he's crushed. I mean, he loves this son, even though his son has rebelled against him. So that could be kind of the classic explanation. But the other is, he's now looking back at his life. It's not clear, whoever's writing this, it's not necessarily David, that he has a life of struggles, but it doesn't seem like this has prompted this psalm by an enemy on the cusp of attack. This is his own grappling with his own physical ratcheting down. And in that sense, as he looks at the enemy, let them be shamed, rather than some of that stronger language. It's already not the urgency that warrants that quality of extreme response. The other thing to note that I'm reminded of in this psalm, I'll tell you Martin Cohen, who I often quote. What Martin Cohen does, and Richard Levy in particular, who are contemporary commentators, is ask the question, how is this relevant for us? Martin Cohen, here's his question. This is somebody who grew up with a relationship with God. From the womb you knew me. And he asks the question that's prompted for him, do you have to have known God your whole life, been taught about God, to have this quality of faith in God, this trust? Can you come to God with questions and develop trust? He leaves it as the question. I just share with you the kind of question that can emerge. But to pull this together, because I'm concerned always not taking too long, so to pull together Psalm 71, what I continue to return to in delighting with this psalm is the expression of the reality of life review with purpose. Because what this psalmist says is, God, let me share with your Zeroah, your arm. What is Zeroah? That's the image used in the deliverance from Egypt, right? Im Zeroah Gedolah, with a great arm I brought you out of the land of Egypt. And here the psalmist will say, let me tell the next generations about your arm, about your deliverance, about how you've been there for me, that my purpose is singing your praise so that the praises will continue in the next generation. And with the awareness of purpose, that's the shift in this psalm to jubilation and exuberance with the closing lines. And I just, again, delight in this as spiritual poetry, a prayer to God about the aging process, and yet in doing so, finding purpose and celebration. I love it. And Psalm 72, I'm going to tell you why I'm excited to share with you Psalm 72 tomorrow. I have somehow moved it from my desk, but it's framed as if a prayer by King David on behalf of King Solomon asked to let him be a good king. Let my son be a good king. And what does it mean? What is the nature of this prayer? Let him be mindful of the lowly, of the poor. And the commentators will emphasize, including an important Christian commentator, that this psalm says that what defines a king is not strength against enemies, of armies, of wealth. What defines the worthiness of a king, as described in Psalm 72 tomorrow, is the sensitivity to those who need support and justice. So elegantly written. It's the end tomorrow of the second book of Psalms. One last thing. The opening word of Psalms, Psalm 1. Oh, also Julia got that book. All right, 2 people. And Shelby did also. Psalm 72, the last thought for tomorrow coming attraction. The opening word of Psalms is Ashrei. Happy is the one. It's the last word of Psalm 42 which is book 1, Psalm 72. It's the last word of the 4th and 5th book. And the last line of the 5th book is Kol Neshama Hallelujah, Hallelujah. Let every soul praise God. And so a common theme that ends each of the books of Psalms is a sense that living a spiritual life leads to contentment. So tomorrow, the end, a celebration of finishing the second book of Psalms. Delighted to be able to share this with you. Have a good day. Be well. Thank you. Be well.
Rabbi Kaddish?
Thank you. Thank you, Mimi.
I don't.
Those having a loved one to honor, I invite you to join today. I'll do it in the transliteration side, in this prayer of honoring. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabba bi'alma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute b'chayechon uvyomechon uvchaye v'chol beit Yisrael ba'agala v'zman kari v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehi shmei rabba mevarach le'olam olmeo maya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yita'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudsha b'richu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran v'yoma v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Osei shalom b'imromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'kol b'nei tevel v'imru amen.
Amen.
Thank you again. Have a good day.